lot of my friends, a lot of them kind of are like, no, but I don't want to waste my degree. I don't want to.
Yeah,
I think this idea of sunk cost fallacy is huge.
absolutely.
And I think is massive, and it comes to even now in my day to day. It's still really important, but just knowing when to give up, and it's not even give up, but knowing when to just change course or change route.
So normally when I interview people, I have this sort of preconceived notion that there are going to be a set number of topics that I'm going to be talking about. The respondent is going to respond in a certain way. And for the most part, the conversation should go in the way that I predicted it in my head. Now, in this situation, I had the wonderful pleasure of speaking to Pranab, and that is not exactly how things went. When I originally approached Pranab, I wanted to pick his brains mostly about his experience in the performance marketing space as a highly experienced performance marketer himself, working in a venture capital startup. And so when we started talking, what I realized is that Pranab is not only really knowledgeable about the topic that I was actually intending to talk about, he also had a really good understanding about how to find out what you really want to do with your life and how to build a career that you can really enjoy and find meaning in. And it really got me reflecting hard about sort of what sort of direction that I wanted to go in. So hopefully you guys enjoy this as much as I did. I'm going to cut straight to the interview now. Hey there, Pranab. Thanks so much for hopping on. Really excited for this. How are you doing, first of all?
Hey, good man. Good to talk to you.
Awesome stuff. I've had the pleasure of working with you briefly, and obviously I'm very excited to be picking your brains today. But for the people listening or who don't have as much context about you, could you give us a brief sort of breakdown as to what it is that you do on a day-to-day basis, and your role and what you do?
Yeah, so I work at Boundless, which is a venture studio, and I'm the main growth marketing manager we have in house. So Boundless, it'd be hard to explain what I do without explaining what Boundless does. So Boundless creates companies, creates and incubates companies in the vertical SaaS space. So you can think of equipment rental, construction, trucking, municipal services, any kind of just like vertical niche that may not have an extremely large TAM, like the productivity space. Like we're not trying to build a Notion or an Asana or something like that, but something specific to an industry and just go really deep in that industry. And my job essentially is to help get our companies from 1 to 10 or 1 to 100. You can think of a lot of phases in a company or product growth journey. There's that 0 to 1 phase of like, how do you get your first customer or 2 or 3? And then there's kind of the, you have a bunch of customers and you're trying to go for scale. And that's like, there's a bunch of stuff there. You can think of Uber or Facebook or, yeah, exactly. Right. Just like the super high growth, big startup kind of vibe. But there's not a lot talked about in that 1 to 100 phase. Like, how do you go from the first few customers you have to 100? Do you hire someone for that? Do you not? Do you kind of like just as a founder, do you do it yourself? Like, what kind of team do you have? And that's kind of where I've done a lot of things in the last few years, that 1 to 100 phase. So mainly my main job is acquiring customers, but then there's all this stuff around other marketing things like helping define our product marketing, our ICP, initial customer profiles, our marketing ops, kind of like our systems and sales or CRM and all the tooling that needs to come in, deciding what tooling not to have and what needs to be done later. Yeah, so that's kind of my job. I essentially work across a few different companies in our portfolio, but the majority of my time, maybe 80%, is with one. For my first year of working at Boundless, I had one company that we hired Johnny and his team to support on Facebook ads for. And then in the last couple of months, I transitioned to another one that's a bit earlier in the process. And I also have like a little bit of time spent with our entrepreneurs and residents that are kind of incubating new ideas and figuring out what other companies to build. So yeah, just kind of I think that's a decent summary of all this.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I absolutely love the fact that you focus not just on the typical productivity, the next sort of Notion or Use Motion or Asana, all the big names that we typically associate with SaaS companies. I definitely feel, especially because those industries that you mentioned, they're not, at least to my knowledge, they're not always the most familiar with technology, and the fact that you guys make that really accessible for them, I think is a really good initiative, and just makes you realize, oh yes, of course, the SaaS space is so countlessly varied and just so deep in whatever industry you go into. So what I want to now dive into after this is talk about your sort of journey into becoming the sort of growth marketer. I think you have a fairly similar background to me, in that we both did engineering at university, or I guess for you it's college. How does one go from sort of, engineering, doing calculus flow diagrams, to then moving on into growth marketing? Like, where did that start? Was this something that you always thought about, or Was it a previous experience? Were you never really looking to go into chemistry? What was the story?
Yeah.
And I'll leave it to you. Yeah.
No, that's a great question, and it's something that it took a lot of introspection and effort, and just like emotional processing of making sure like, well, am I leaving this degree behind and changing this life, and was it all to waste? Like questions like that, I think are
Yeah.
pretty common in any kind of a career transition. But yeah. So I did my undergrad in chemical engineering at the University of Texas. So great school, great program. UT Austin has a big oil and gas focus, just Texas. And yeah, going into it, I honestly thought about. I was really into being a chemical engineer. I thought it was really interesting. I like the course content. I think the idea of like, oh, cool, chemical engineers study how things are made, and this is how like the world works. Like plastic and semiconductors and biotech. Like it was all really interesting to me as an idea.
Yeah, no, I think I was the same with my degree as well. Like when
You
we
did
just first get
industrial,
in.
right?
No, I did biomedical, so it was more
Biomedical.
for like medical devices, that sort of thing. And when I
Yep.
first got in, I just thought, wow, this is definitely what I
Yeah.
wanted to do at the
It's,
time. Yeah.
it's it's all pretty cool. Like and it's like pretty like difficult stuff. And back then I thought like, oh, okay, if it's like hard, that means it's good, which is
Yeah.
not wrong exactly, but it's like it's a bit more than that. So yeah, I mean, it was cool. Learned a lot about it, and then I got my first co-op. It's basically an internship, but like during the school year. So I worked at a large petrochemical manufacturer in Houston at the refinery. That was interesting. It was cool. I was like, okay, cool. It's like good experience. I'm getting paid well. Interesting problems. There was a lot of stuff that I was kind of not great at. Like it was very physical. It was very like you have to like climb equipment and kind of like and talking to operators was really interesting. And then
Interesting.
you had to like wake up early at like 5 a.m. to go to the
Oh
meetings. And
wow.
there's
Yeah.
times in the plant like pretty predictably where it's called a turnaround where everything gets turned off and you like there's like people work 24/7, like quite literally you have like 80-hour weeks, and it was a
Crikey.
whole interesting lifestyle, and
Hmm.
I got pretty deep into understanding what that was like and all the different players in the industry. I thought about working offshore, and fast forward, I basically had like near the end of my degree, I worked about a year total in 3 different co-ops, but it was at different plants throughout the U.S. A couple in Houston, one in the Midwest. But basically, I by the end of that, I slowly started realizing maybe this isn't for me. I
Yeah.
started learning like, oh, okay, even with this degree, I could get into like business consulting, like Deloitte and a lot of other consulting firms recruited at my campus, and I went to all those information sessions, and I was like, oh, actually, engineering is cool, but I think I like the business side a bit more and just understanding how different businesses operate in a bunch of different industries. I kind of realized that on that existing path, I could work in a business function, but after like 5 years, it was a very traditional kind of workplace. And then, and then I slowly started realizing like, wait, technology is a thing and entrepreneurship is really interesting. And I don't think I would really build any transferable skills by staying on the path that I'm on.
Mm.
So I remember during my last term, I thought I remember just kind of realizing I was done, maybe midway, and I
Right.
spent a lot of my job just kind of reading Paul Graham essays and looking at technology blogs and listening to a lot of Tim Ferriss podcasts, like on my way to and from work. And yeah, it was really interesting. I kind of realized like, okay, I have to like make a giant leap. Yeah, and
Interesting.
yeah. So
That's what kicked it all off, I
yeah,
guess.
that's what kicked it all off. And I was also, I think, part of what caused me to do that reflection was I had a girlfriend at the time, and I was like,
Right.
wait a minute. After graduation, I have to either live in a small town or Houston. I don't know if she would want to do that. And I was, what do I want to do? And it made me just really
Yeah.
think about what I wanted for my life, because I think I had this idea that, oh, I could like live anywhere. I could be in a small town. It's all
Right.
fine. But then I was like, wait, what do I actually want? And then
Yeah.
made me kind of realize like, oh, there's like a huge opportunity, and it just seems way more interesting to work in the general quote unquote technology startup field. And you can work across a ton of different products, ton of different industries. You just like work with people a lot more. Like the field of design and understanding user psychology was super interesting to me. And yeah, so that's kind of the first part. If you have any questions.
Yeah, no, that's super. I think a lot of people around about our sort of age bracket could probably sort of resonate with that. You have this sort of set idea of what it is that you want to do, and by the time you get to, I think for you, it's like towards the end of, similar to me, by the end of, by the time you get to the end of your, I think it's for you guys senior year, or for
Yep.
us, final year of university, you start realizing, oh, and the deadline approaches, and you start realizing, oh, actually, hang on a sec, like from far away it looked like this was definitely feasible, but then once you actually get there you think, oh no, this is not what I totally thought it was. And you just kind of have to rethink things. And yeah, it's interesting that you also kind of had that period similar to what I had, where I just find myself listening and reading a lot about these sort of areas, and I think, am I actually, wait, hang on a second, this is way more interesting than the stuff that I've been previously learning. And you almost feel like, oh, that's not right. Like I shouldn't, because I've put all this energy into
Yes.
4 years of learning this skill set, slaving away at calculus, fluid mechanics, thermodynamics, and then suddenly to kind of drop that and move it
Yes.
in somewhere else, I think is, yeah.
100%. I remember like at that time, I think like a few of the biggest things that have helped me in that. So I think in like near my third year, basically, I started listening to a lot of podcasts. So it's like Tim Ferriss, Seth Godin, and they're all business focused. They all have like a life improvement bent to it, or kind of
Yeah,
just
for
like
sure.
like reflective and thoughtful and all that kind of stuff. And it really changed my life. Like I think there's that whole you're the five people, you're the sum of the
Of
five
course.
people, or the average of the five people you're around. And I think if podcasts count, if you just have a lot of
Yeah, I mean,
uh,
you're listening to it all the time, right? Then for sure you're hanging around them,
exactly.
basically, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I used to drive between Austin and Houston, which is like a 3 hour drive every weekend. So that was like a lot of podcast time. And yeah, and I think just like there's a book called Design Your Life that I ended up reading kind of later than I wish I had, but it was the principles in that were all really helpful. Just
Mm,
understanding like, wait a minute, you have this idea of what day to day life is like, and then you actually like start doing it, and you're like, wait a minute, this is not like what I thought a chemical engineer did is not what a chemical engineer does. And then and you realize it's more than kind of, especially in university, there's a very like subject and top down view of like, oh, you're going to go into law or medicine or this or that, just as
yeah,
these ideas like what is this idea of law or medicine or engineering or computer science. And no one actually knows like, well, do you like sitting down, do you like walking around, do you like, what kind of people do you like talking to, like what kind of like, do you like, even if something as simple as do you like
yeah,
being in sunlight or being outdoors. And
of
those are all
course.
the, I mean, as small as they are, those are all, a lot of the things that kind of make your day to day really energizing or de-energizing. And there's more than that too, but I think that's kind of
Mm.
the line of questioning and line of looking that started really helping me.
Yeah, to some degree, almost you almost have to just go and try it to see if it's actually
Yes.
for you. And there's
Yeah.
nothing you can do. You can think, oh no, that was a waste, but actually, you didn't really have a choice because there was no way you could have
Yep.
possibly known, right?
And I think like a way that people can like, because I think a lot of times you definitely have to try it out. But I think in a lot of my friends that were on a similar thing, a lot of them kind of ignored looking in those ways because they were like, no, but I don't want to waste my degree. I don't want to.
Yeah,
I think this idea of sunk cost fallacy is huge.
absolutely.
And I think is massive. And it comes to like even now in my day to day with Boundless, it's still really important. But just knowing like when to give up, and it's not even give up, but knowing when to just change course or change route. And even if you've invested like 3 or 4 years into something, that doesn't mean you should do another 3 or 4 more years. Maybe it means
Yeah.
like that's giving you the skills to realize you should do something else. And I think being able to make that change is, for me, it was extremely helpful. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. It's a pretty good, not just career, but also life lessons in there. So you mentioned Boundless. I kind of want to get a little bit more into the sort
Yeah.
of maybe nuts and bolts and technical nitty gritty. Obviously, you've done a lot of work going from 1 to 100, but you've also got a little bit of experience in going from sort of 0 to 1 as well. So I thought I'd just start things off in the chronological order. When you're sort of working across these sort of companies, right? One of the things I'm always quite curious about is, what is that sort of a initial strategy look like? I think for at least 1 or 2 companies, you've kind of been there almost at the beginning with the founder, working with
Yep.
them side by side, seeing those first 1 to 10 customers. I think this is one of the more popular things that people always ask, because obviously you can look at these large companies saying, well, obviously they're going to acquire more customers and they're obviously going to continue to grow because they're already massive. But what about the small guys? What about the smaller players in the market? How do you even get those sort of first customers who have never heard about your software, especially in an industry where that Boundless operates in, where people are often a little bit, slightly more averse to technology than usual? How does that sort of process work, and what are the sort of the first actions, and where do you even begin, I guess? So I don't know, it's
Totally.
a big question to tackle, but hopefully you can
Totally.
smash some
Yeah.
light on it.
So I'll just give a minute of preface. Basically, so after a year of figuring out how to get into growth and tech, I started working at this company called Samsara Technologies in San Francisco, and they
Right.
were at scale. So I was on a 30-person growth team, had great mentorship. It was divided between like growth engineering, growth marketing, growth ops, and a giant sales team, really well run machine, super systematized. It's still a startup, just 5 years in, but just one of those amazingly well run, high growth tech startups. And that was great training for how that worked. And also just how to look at problems, how to think through things from a strategic point of view. And that is what really helped me when I started going that zero to one, 1 to 10, 10 to 100 kind of thing. And I think that is actually 0 to 1 is one kind of regime, 1 to 10 is another one, then 10 to 100 is another one, and 100 to 1,000. I haven't really had much experience in that space, but I think it's similar, but or it's its own thing. But yeah, and so before going to Boundless, I started doing freelance work with my friend's company, Divisional Growth. So they pivoted since, but they were a growth agency that worked with founders and kind of pre-seed, seed, Series A startups. So I that's when I really started working on the from the beginning. There was a company in the healthcare space that I think a month after they incorporated, I started working with them on Google Ads to do some initial tests and
Right.
understanding. And then the company in the education space that just was going through Y Combinator, about to go to demo day. Another company. There were a few companies in a few different industries that I worked at from various 0 to 1, 1 to 10, 10 to 100 stages in various capacities. So I got to really see how, while some are different, and obviously the industry makes a difference. A lot of them are really similar. And I think that the phases basically, I think that 0 to 1, that kind of just has to be the founder because you have to understand in the early stages, you have a bunch of variables and a bunch of stuff, and you're trying to figure out, all right, is the product good? Space. And let's try the healthcare, this
Right.
aspect of the healthcare space and just and you should have some initial background to kind of know it deeply enough, but you can ask
Mm-hmm.
a lot of questions and talk to people and really become an expert somewhat fast.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and I guess in some ways that's it's quite advantageous. I think perhaps maybe your engineering background helps that because a lot of that initial work that engineers tend to do is just do a lot of research, do a lot of background, gather a lot of information. Even if you think about it from a research standpoint, so if you may be
Yep.
moving into some PhD, which is definitely more research driven, you just have to it's just about gathering that initial data because you don't have that at the beginning, and just because you don't have that doesn't mean that you can't go and acquire it. So I think that's a really valuable lesson in that sort of regard. So
Totally. And,
yeah,
and I will say, I think the founders that I've worked with that really know their space and know the terminology and know how the market segments itself do a lot better, or at least have an easier time in some ways than ones that don't, because you just have clarity. You're not really, you don't have to deal, oh, is it this or that? Should we go after this or that? What will those mean for our business? Will these people churn? Will those people churn? Again, a lot of this you find out just from experience. But I think there is a lot of stuff you don't have to quote unquote learn the hard way just by
yeah,
learning from, being thoughtful and reflective and talking to people. As much of that as you can, that gives you an unfair advantage.
yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, so I guess there's a difference between learned, being in the trenches, but just because you haven't been in the trenches, so to speak, doesn't necessarily mean that you
Yeah,
can't then acquire that yourself, or at least find other people who can help you with that.
it's what I mean. They're 30-year soft, maybe not 30-year at this point, but they're 20-year softwares that they've been in the trenches the entire time. But why aren't they doing that well? And because a lot of it comes from how you take that experience and how you use it. And I think the view you come from and the way you kind of use that information can. There's in a lot of startup speak. There's depending on your y-intercept versus your slope. Just being able
Yeah.
to work with knowledge better that increases your slope and that helps you kind of grow a lot faster.
Interesting. So you really mentioned that there are some companies, they may have been in a certain space for a while, but they don't necessarily see that sort of same meteoric growth. In your experience, with the experience that you have, do you see any sort of common threads or maybe not even mistakes, but just things that companies just don't do that make it a lot harder for them to kind of get that sort of accelerated growth? Obviously, you've mentioned, for example, if they, may not have that same sort of in-depth industry experience, which it definitely helps, but it's not completely necessary. What are there certain things that you just think that you see a lot of early stage startups, for example, or even late stage startups do that just really hinder
Yeah,
their own growth?
yeah, totally. I mean, well, doing it from the thing, what to do well. I think Samsara, like the first place I worked at, it's just extremely well run, and I really do think a lot of it just comes from, you could just say, good leadership or just a good team. And by good, good means a lot of different things. It really is a mindset, and it really is how people approach their day to day and their week to week and their month to month. And again, it's really about, are you growing? And growing can be a lot of external metrics. Oh, are you getting more customers and growing revenue? But a lot of those are technically lagging metrics from just how well you know your almost clarity of thought and kind of clarity of decision making and clarity of doing things, your day to day output. And very very tangibly, what I mean by that. So Samsara, for example, was founded in 2014. It's essentially it's in the telematics space, so GPS and asset tracking in the trucking logistics space. It went into then machine learning assisted cameras for safety features and a bunch of other now there's a bunch of other stuff going on post IPO and all that. But it was
Mm.
founded in 2014, and the growth trajectory of it started off, it went from 0 people to maybe 10 people. And I'm definitely going to get this wrong, but the gist is
Yeah.
basically 10. And then by end of 2015, it was maybe 100 people, and then 300 people, and then 800
Mm.
people. And then by the time I joined in 2019, I was an employee at 12. I would think I was interviewed as, by the time I interviewed, there were 900 people. By the time I joined, it was like 1,200 people. So it's just, it's just massive growth over four or
Crazy
five
growth.
years. And there were layoffs with COVID, and
Of
kind of the
course.
financial situation, and that's part of what you get for hypergrowth companies too. You're hiring ahead of time, and you have forward projections. But even now, even post IPO, they're
Mm.
growing, I don't know, 10-20% quarter over quarter, or something crazy, something ridiculous that justifies a giant multi-billion-dollar valuation. And it's, this is the truck tele. There were existing players, there were startups in the space. Why couldn't they do what Samsara did? And I think it really is kind of, you could say culture, or you could just say how work is done, or just how, but it's really just the quality of all the interactions, which you could say is culture.
Mm.
And very tangibly, the CEO, Sanjit Biswas, he was a great leader. I never really worked with him directly, right? But he would give these for every month, every new hire tranche would get kind of a presentation, and it just showed kind of the clarity of the initial story of how customer focused it was, and how much it was, wait, so let me just tinker around and see what actually works, and then kind of just go from there. And then kind of just like thoughtfulness and scaling up and building a team and hiring people. He started this company called Meraki, which was, I think, corporate Wi-Fi stuff that then sold to Cisco. And yeah, I mean, it just, I think there's a lot of factors, right? But
Mm.
using trends, seeing how he saw in the team, early team saw that the cost of cameras was going way down, the cost of data was going way down, but a lot of these companies weren't working with the reflection of that new market reality. So just taking advantage of arbitrage, seizing opportunity, doing things day to day, having a customer focus. It's a bunch of stuff, right? That
Yeah.
all sounds kind of small or trite,
Yeah.
but really added up, it leads to a giant success.
I find it super interesting that you actually you talked, you talked about all these other things that I think, at least for me, you would think were the main things. But actually, the thing that you seem to highlight was that the culture, and obviously in tech, you think a lot about the tech itself, and you think about all the
Yep.
systems and processes and the actual deliverable itself. But the fact that you mentioned that the people and the culture are actually the thing that really drives things forwards,
Yeah.
I think that really stands out to me, because I was always expecting some sort of, oh, they had a great product and they had a great this, but actually, you're talking more about the people that actually run it. And I think that's something, at least for me, or to a lot of people, can be massively overlooked, perhaps because it can be a bit of a buzzword in the industry. Obviously, everyone wants to talk about great team culture, but what even
Yep.
is that? And yeah, no, that gives a huge sort of insight how it can start from top down, but then you can make that trickle down, even no matter how big the company is. I think that's
Totally.
super true.
100%. I mean, even articulating that, I think even one of the reasons out of why I even got in from chemical engineering to technology. So when I started getting the thought of wanting to switch, I ended up getting a internship in Capital One, the bank. It's a US
Yeah.
based bank, but they're a bit
Yes.
more tech forward. And I worked as a Scrum Master, which is like a process.
Yeah,
Uh,
I remember that. Yeah.
yeah. So it's
Yeah.
kind of very process focused, and you're a
Mm.
process manager. It's interesting. It was really cool. But I think the biggest takeaway I got from that was just validation that I was definitely on the right track. I remember a 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. meeting at stand up meeting essentially at the chemical plant. We'd all have to print out our paper, and we'd all just kind of do our updates, and it took a while, and it was kind of boring, and it was just very, just was, yeah, all right, this is how we do things. And it was like that for so many years, and the people there were there for a long time. And those, all those aren't terrible, aren't red flags, but I brought up, hey, we should change things, or kind of do things differently, or think about the process, or trying to, if we do this, we can save some time here.
Mm.
And it wasn't really received very well. It was kind of like, I mean, it's fine, it's not a big deal. What's the big deal about it? Versus in
Mm.
Capital One, my job was just thinking about the process of the engineers, and like, hey, we should ask these questions during retro, and that'll lead to this much productivity improvement. And some of
Yeah.
it was maybe a little
It's
overboard,
that
but it
that
was
growth mindset, I suppose, right? Yeah. Yeah.
exactly kind of just it was and if you look at even just a big picture, the philosophy of software, all the whole point of what our companies are doing are just giving productivity improvements or process
Of course.
improvements. You just have to, and from a business point of view, you have to see, oh, these are the 7 steps. Can we reduce it to 3? Can we reduce friction? Can we reduce your headache? It's very weird. It's not
Mm.
where I mean, obviously, it's also technology, but in some
Yeah.
ways, the technology is in service to making everyone's lives easier. And that's the fact that a lot of technology companies and software companies, especially in the B2B space, that's the reason for being. So from a point of being, it seeps into how you do your day to day. This is why tech has all these podcasts and kind of things on product. Why the tech space and the productivity improvement space are so tightly linked, because they're the kind of stuff you're building. Versus in chemical engineering or older industries, you just have these. My goal is to increase the flow of oil through a pipe, and that's a very tangible, measured thing. And no one really thinks about how if you have this tooling software versus that tooling software, why it's how it helps. And it's interesting because bringing that to Boundless, we're building software for those types of companies, that may have not previously
Yeah,
thought
it's
about this
almost gone
stuff.
full circle, right?
Exactly.
So
In a way, it's kind of cool.
yeah, do you find that there's almost a difficulty in do you also realize a lot of your role is almost change management because as you mentioned these people are they're not really thinking about how they can improve their sort of
Yeah.
process, and when you come along and say, hey, check out the software, it's really going to reduce your headache, do you often find that you have resistance with them? What are the sort of ways you kind of overcome that, perhaps, if you don't mind
100%,
sharing?
100%. I often know I didn't really know what consultants did, and then change management consultant, and
Yeah.
all this stuff. And I had friends that worked at these large consultancies that did large enterprise change management stuff, and I had a roommate that did that. It's really cool. It's interesting, right? But
Of
at
course.
first, I was like, "Are you even doing anything? It's just fluffy. You just have
Of course, yeah,
PowerPoints
no,
and."
that's what I thought as well, yeah.
Totally, but it's,
Absolutely.
it's a real thing, and I mean, in a corporate environment, it probably sucks. I haven't had a ton of experience there. I did at Capital One, but I didn't
Mm,
have any position of leadership or authority there, right?
yeah.
But yeah, I, it really is all about change management, because I think
Mm,
even day to day in work, after a quarter is done, you have to refresh and rethink and get a bigger picture idea. And
of
yeah, anytime
course.
you bring on a new software, what you're changing is your process and your habits. So
Absolutely.
I think even things like atomic habits or just thinking about habit change and
Yeah.
doing things differently, it probably helps. And to be fair, it's not as important in smaller businesses. So kind of the 0 to 1, 1 to 10 phase. We also typically grow in company size, go in target company size during that thing too. It's a lot easier in the beginning to sell to another small business or to a small business, because it's just the founder, the CEO, or the manager. And once you get into enterprise, you have 10 people and you have your champions, and that's when the B2B sales cycle, all that terminology matters, and that's where change management and decision making make more of a difference. And but yeah, but it is a lot of coaching and feedback, and you want to make sure your
Yeah.
onboarding is helpful, so they know how to use it and they know how to actually get value from the product. And how we measure that, you can have a magic moment once they hit a certain activation milestone. That means cool, they've they've at least gotten some value, and they'll probably kind of just go on their own.
Yeah.
And a lot of this depends on your contract size. If they're a large enough contract, you can actually have a customer success rep to guide them through that whole thing and ask them support questions. Versus if you have a smaller contract size, you may need to just do more PLG, like growth, or kind of they just kind of figure it out on their own after. And maybe you have some tooltips on your screen for guidance and onboarding. You can't really afford the time to kind of nurture everyone one by one. At the beginning, I think the founder should, for the first 20 to 50 customers, really go through and help all of them kind of in that change management and process management. Um,
Yeah.
and I remember at Samsara, once we started hitting enterprise accounts, we had a team that was essentially a change management team for them. They would go in, they would make
Right.
presentations to give to their leadership on, hey, here's how we're doing, here's how Samsara helps, here's the value. I also,
Interesting.
yeah. So short answer, yes, but it depends on the client size.
Yeah, it's super interesting that you talk about it in this way because it's almost you get so bogged down by the tech, you forget actually, wait, this tech is for people at the end of the day, and it's almost like you can always, I think a lot of founders and a lot of companies can almost hide behind that sort of layer of technology, and then you forget
Yeah,
actually this is just in some ways you could almost say it's just management consulting with extra
yeah,
steps, and you just have
yeah,
this extra tool which you could almost think that almost like a separate person in a sense that just helps out with that, but you're still doing the same things. You just have this assistant that just never sleeps and does a lot
totally.
of work for you, and you just have that sort of human support factor. So
Yeah,
yeah.
even one. If I ever wanted to just have a different kind of career, I feel like a totally ripe market for solo businesses. And I've seen this kind of outed on some podcasts I've listened to, of just being someone that helps implement software. that's a thing for hubs, especially for CRMs. That's like already
Yeah.
industry. There are whole agencies and businesses around like, taking on Salesforce or HubSpot and helping you implement it and the best practices and day to day helping you. Sales ops. Sales ops became a thing because that's it's so complicated and you have a giant team. But I think we start seeing ops functions in various fields. Product ops is a thing to help the product management team with product management tools, your mix panel, your amplitude, and your custom. There's design ops that help. It's essentially your change manager slash process manager. You're kind of there's a scrum master
Yeah.
for all these different functions. Marketing ops is, I mean, it's not exactly this. Each of those also has a bunch of other components as well, but and they're all a little bit different too. But the general gist, I think, kind of, I see a bit of a trend there.
Yeah, for sure. And going back a few steps, I noticed that you were talking about sort of the different changes that you're kind of mentioning how at the beginning probably the founder probably has to do a lot of the work, and I see this trend for sure when listening to a lot of podcasts and founder podcasts. I recently listened to one about the founder of Superhuman and how even though he was a founder and he technically could have been working on a lot of other things, he chose to actually go through the demos and walk through himself. And obviously as you grow larger you have to then pick the right sort of team members to come into the picture as well. What for you, what are the maybe talking first about hiring, but what are the sort of the key differences when you go from that 0 to 1 versus 1 to 10 versus 10 to 100? I guess if we start with hiring, what are the sort of, what do you think are the most critical points of hire, and how do you know, is there a framework that you guys are bound to use for figuring out when to hire for what? Yeah. What's that sort of process like
Yeah.
for you guys? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll share. This is definitely not my expertise, and I'm still learning a ton in this space as well. But from what I've seen from how we're managing at Boundless, I think it's tricky. It's tricky because well, I guess short answer I don't really know.
Yeah. That's fine.
And I think if I had to give my best guess, it's kind of just seeing what's needed. And Quickly, for example, which is the equipment rental startup that you're helping on, we noticed that so it's just it's a more difficult onboarding given the nature of the product. So we had to hire customer success. It's just we had to hire someone to manage onboarding and implementation, and then that person needed interns, and that's just where we kind of grew. I think engineering hiring, I'm really not as familiar with product building, so I think that's just a separate thing. You kind of just have to, yeah, that's a separate thing. I just don't
Yeah.
have good knowledge on. But on the business functions, yeah, customer success, it just becomes clear what you need. Something I do really know well. Yeah, on the marketing, on the go to market and RevOps side, you don't really need to hire too many growth marketers. You kind of just need, if you have one, maybe two people, because if you think of the function of growth marketing, it's to build systems. And those systems don't need more people, they just need more spend in some ways. Once you have Google Ads, you don't need two people to manage Google Ads.
Yeah.
If it's at 100 a month versus a million a month, you just put more money and that person puts, there's different stuff to do. In some sense, it can be set it and forget it, and then you'd revisit it every few weeks to
Yeah.
adjust and edit. But that's one thing. And then and then there maybe some manual work with ops work and all that. But yeah, but if you find that sales is really helpful and pretty much is a cost effective way to get customers, then you just have to keep hiring salespeople.
Mm.
But yeah,
Yeah.
and then product, you don't need too many product people. Just kind of maybe for a long time that's just the founder, and then when the founder really needs to do other stuff, then maybe you hire a product person. It's tricky. Kind of, yeah. Again,
Yeah.
it just depends. At Truckbase, which is the company I'm working on now, we don't need customer success. It's very easy implementation and onboarding, but we have two salespeople already, whereas Cooply did
Mm.
not earlier on in the process because we're finding that sales is quite helpful.
So I guess it is sort of like case on case sort of basis, and the sort of classic idea of a startup. You almost have to kind of, I think there's that saying where it's almost like you're just building the plane as it goes down. You just kind of take things up as you need it, not doing too much in advance before you need it, but also
Yeah,
making sure you get the timing just right so that you're not sort of short staffed when the need is really there and then you can't take
totally.
it on, sort of
It's
thing. So
tricky. I think if anything, if I had to give actual genuine advice that's more just general, but I think is actually real, is just you just have to have a reflective process every week or month and just look back and be. There's probably some questions you can ask. What took a lot of time? What where was the value actually like? And just kind of understanding where you're putting your time in and where you see more time needing to be. Because it's okay if it's very clear in 6 months we're gonna have 100 customers. Who's gonna implement those 100 customers? It can't be me. That's gonna be just kind of
yeah.
forecasting what the bottlenecks and constraints will be. I think that's what so leadership at Boundless is really good at doing this. Okay, let's say you had $10 million. What would you do? Or let's say you hit all your how would you hit your 1 year goals in 1 month? Just kind of thinking really big and kind of really huge and just seeing where would you go if you already had the success you had or if, in that reality, which is hard to do day to day because you have to like, do your day to
Yeah.
day work. But having times to kind of think that far ahead and really see, oh, okay, we can't do these things because we're going to be blocked on here. So maybe we should hire these people or figure out a way to take on tech debt in that sense until we, so
Yeah.
yeah, like reflection, having people to talk to help you kind of think about the big picture and think about your systems. I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you talk about, seeing far ahead, but also you still have to deal with the data. I see this all the time, in the sort of content that I consume in this sort of space. It's just that balance of looking far ahead enough that you don't do things today that are going to detriment that future vision, but also dealing with that sort of day to day. So having both and juggling those both, and I guess that's why it's really hard, because those are completely two contrasting
Yep.
different things, and they run in opposite directions, but you still have to make them play nice with
Which is
one
how it
another.
is.
So that's just how, yeah, I suppose that's
Yeah.
just nothing you can do about it, right? Fantastic. Okay, so another thing I kind of wanted to ask you about is, obviously there's a lot of, you've seen a lot of success and growing a lot of sort of different companies in this sort of SaaS vertical. Is there ever a time, and you don't have to name any sort of specific names, but are there any sort of, maybe not red flags, but any sort of specific instances where you just think this doesn't, for example, have any sort of legs, or and how would you sort of recognize
Yeah.
that and know when to, not give up, but maybe even pivot or change things up a bit? What are some of the key markers for you guys?
Totally. Yeah, it's interesting. I think I am very fortunate in that because I got to work with so many companies from the freelance or the client manager perspective as a working through an agency, and then the value of, and then kind of the whole model of Boundless, I got to see when companies weren't a good fit and kind of develop my own kind of attunement to that. Because I think this applies obviously from an investor point of view or a builder point of view of when do you kind of move or pivot, but even from a career point of view, how do you know when your company is just not great? Because I think often the best companies to work for are ones, if you can put on an investor hat, what would you invest in? Because if it's not something you really believe in or see the future of, then it's not probably a great place to work for. But yeah, I think so at Boundless, we incubate companies, and obviously not everyone's going to have a win. We hope to have a high hit rate, but not everything is. So we actually did shut down a company we were working on for about a year, and no, and so I can have some general lessons from that. And really, it kind of is just at each stage, just knowing what is appropriate, and then kind of seeing, just having making sure you're not pushing it farther than it has. You got to make sure it meets the 0 to 1 criteria well, and then the 1 to 10
Right.
criteria well, and then maybe it won't meet the 10 to 100, and that's okay. But yeah,
Right.
I think product market fit is the general thing, and it's really just like, how do customers feel about the product? Do they get excited? Do they not? Is it really hard to get them in? And once they're in, do they use it? And so a lot of it is like intangible, qualitative feel, and because a lot of the and just knowing that, and knowing when that is fixed versus when that's something that you just can't do anything else with, versus when that's fixed versus that's something that you
Yeah.
can change. And I think it just kind of takes time and just honesty and just reflection. So,
Mm,
if it's, for this company, we had a few customers that came in. We couldn't really, the sales cycle was pretty difficult. It was definitely outside of the cost per acquisition was getting difficult, and it was hard to get, it just wasn't a pricing fit with kind of the people we were going after. And then, after some time, we kept hitting that wall, and we had a couple breakthroughs. Okay, this is really promising, and let's see if we can get product channel fit with this segment. And it just wasn't big enough. And then, it just kind of was just really difficult.
mm,
And then we had this other company that just was like really good, and it was just like, it's,
yeah.
people are excited and they really want to get it, and they were like wanting to sign a contract before the product was even ready. And there's a certain sense that, like, when you're working with the portfolio, you can kind of just compare them and just
Yeah.
see what's better or worse. So this kind of just comes from, I think, just a breadth of experience in some ways, because you can just see what works and what doesn't. And even on the client side of things, I could just see when some of the people we were working with was like, this is not doing super well, or this is very much a small business, not a startup, or this is a nice to have, not a need to have. And you kind of, you keep butting into people just not saying no and objections, and just not, your conviction kind of slowly goes down. It's like, does this even make sense to me? And
Yeah.
so it's one of those, and this is all B2B. B2C might be different, right? Because
Hmm.
maybe
Of
you hit
course.
virality and all this other stuff that may be different. But yeah,
I
it's
see.
kind of an intuition, a feeling over time. And I definitely think this can be systematized and processized, and you can have metrics to kind of understand and guide. Not really sure what metrics, maybe around hack and retention and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But yeah, it's kind of a gut feel, I would say, in some ways.
No, it's interesting that you say that, because obviously, like we mentioned earlier, you could, in theory, get all the data together and you could say, okay, well, this one hit this benchmark and this one hit this KPI. But there isn't, especially when you're dealing with people, there's an element of qualitative facets that even if you broke down the numbers about, okay, well, here's our CAC, and some companies, you might be able to break through that hurdle, but for others, just your numbers could technically be fine, but that might, for example, only take you to from 10 to 100, and when you talk to your customers, you kind of realize, oh, actually, this doesn't really have the same sort of scale. So yeah,
Yep.
it's interesting
And,
that you
and
say that. Yeah.
yeah, and I have a founder friend in Austin where I was talking to him, and yeah, again, it comes back to sunk cost fallacy and just honesty and being willing to let go of something that might be working to try to do something even bigger or just a better fit. I think they reached about 1 million ARR and doing well, but they're realizing, wait a minute, they can see in the future this is not really going to grow. We've kind of actually hit our limit. And if we actually want to get to a stage of growth where we want to go, we have to totally rethink our business model and not like redo the product or scrap it or anything, but just like go from B2B to C or something like that, And it's really interesting thinking through those challenges because it just requires real honesty. And the thing is, if you don't, that could be fine, but you just might be at the exact same numbers for 5 years.
Yeah.
And it's all right. I mean, which is also totally okay. You just have
Yeah.
to know what you're getting yourself into and expectation setting.
I think that must be so difficult to hit something like 1 million ARR, which the vast majority of startups don't ever even dream to hit, and then to come to that sort of honest realization that actually this can't go any further. I think you said probably has to take some real gut wrenching honesty to just sit there and think, man, I mean, we've done great so far, but this really can't go any further. So I think, it's probably one of those skills that is quite hard to develop.
Yeah, and I will say it's a skill, but you don't do it alone. I don't think anyone I've seen ever does it by themselves or is fully self-made in that respect. You not need, but it's so helpful to have peers, mentors, just people you can talk to. Your personal life's got to be in check to kind of manage all this business stuff. There's a whole team of people outside of all these business stories and successes we hear, right? Just to be able to manage it all.
Yeah, and I think taking something that I heard a while back, I've just realized is taking that sort of investor mindset view. Not everything that you pursue, and that's not just for startups, but also careers as well. Well, I remember you mentioning that earlier. It could be at the beginning of your career, or maybe earlier on, it might have been a great career for yourself, but later on, if you don't believe in that sort of career path, or even the company, or the career within that company, well, the career within the company is fine, but maybe it'd be better for the company. You kind of have to see at what stage. Just because you're at a point where okay, things are great, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to continue if you go down this path, and you just have to kind of reflect whether it's startup or your own career. Yeah,
which is spot on, and it's tricky too because then then you have to see, okay, when analyzing is great, and at the same time there's the analyzing side and there's just a gut feel side of that's not the right fit. And, usually I think it's easy to talk about this stuff because that's you can talk about it versus you can't necessarily talk about I just felt off. It's like the relationships in a way or dating, which it's a different sphere, but it's very similar. But it's there's some of it red flags and like, oh, it just doesn't make any sense, or it can make total sense and you just have bad gut feel. And I think my personal opinion is you can't just use this I don't think just the fact that they're different it's kind of a cop out. You can kind of translate this to that and that to this. Over time, a gut feel, you can kind of figure out what that's telling you. Honestly, in the last few years, I've gotten way deeper into the emotional side of things, understanding how to work with your intuition and all that. So I think it's really helpful and kind of undervalued and under talked about.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's one of those things that because you have to understand, if you're kind of doing all this thinking, I've seen a lot of friends just overthink and you can see it's coming from a sense of anxiety or fear. And when you quell that, you can kind of still do the thinking, but then you actually can get to an answer that you're at peace with. And then you can move from there. And, we're not all going to be Udos and kind of like, but of course, moving in that direction, I think is not a bad idea.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. It's so fascinating how all these sort of spheres of work and life sort of intersect in that regard. And I think at first they may seem quite disparate, but actually when you think about it, principally even you mentioned it, even something dating could actually have sort of parallels. Obviously not to conflate them too much, obviously that's not let's not make an assumption, but and
again, this is kind of my own personality quirk. I tend to see things from a very high 10,000 foot. Oh, this is connected to this and this is connected to that, and you can maybe a little go too overboard on that, but for me it's been extremely helpful. I think a lot of I have a bit more of a generalist mindset in that sense where I can kind of see a little connections here and there. And some people, I have a lot of friends who are totally successful, totally fine, love their life. And they're very, business is business, dating is dating, this is this. And it's very, very separate for them. That's also totally fine. But I think just how I'm built, I kind of see connections between all of it.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay. So speaking of connections, I think we're heading up towards the end time, so I kind of want to wrap up as best as we can. I think one trending thing I've been seeing over the past few weeks and months, I think it's a huge topic right now, is artificial intelligence and how that's having an impact. So a lot of people talk about this in terms of their careers. I just recently talked about, but in terms of SaaS as well, in your sort of vertical, how do you see that changing things? I'm using maybe 20, 15 different softwares currently for my own professional life at the moment, and I can already see a lot of them are implementing this. Do you think this is a genuine revolution for SaaS, or do you think this is something that will pass, or do you think some of these elements are the right move, but not everyone's implementing this correctly? What are your sort of general thoughts on where these sorts of two, I mean, they're basically almost the same thing, but how do you see them interacting with one another, and where do you think this sort of space is going?
It's fascinating. I think, you could have a whole podcast about this, but I think my short right. I think my short answer, and just because I have friends that work at some of these big AI companies, and it's just the world is going to change significantly faster and significantly bigger than we think in 6 months to a year. Even if we look back at the last year, a year ago, we would not be having this conversation. AI,
and now we have like bad chatbots, and it's just a complete fail.
Totally, and it's every month and every week. It's going to be insane the amount that's possible. I think that's that deserves a bunch of thinking and reflection, kind of understanding what that means for jobs and careers and all that kind of stuff. I think in the short to medium run, the next few years, basically every company probably will integrate AI in some way. But I think the thing that I don't think is talked about as much is at the same time, problems still exist. And all the stuff we talked about change management and older industries, I think in tech forward industries, it'll be somewhat, you're already using, if you're a smaller company and you're kind of tech forward, you're already going to use, Notion that has AI assisted tooling or, generative imagery for sales outbound, whatever, right? For email and all that. And that's going to be there quite quickly. But then next will be larger technology companies and larger startups. And then after that will be kind of the bigger corporates. And then maybe after that will be, I don't know if it's going to be bigger corporates and then, vertical SaaS. It's going to be a long time before it gets evenly distributed, The story that comes to mind is, I remember 2 years ago, I was in South Texas, close to the Mexico border, 2020, 2021. And at a restaurant, someone was hearing about Airbnb for the first time.
Wow.
A friend was telling a friend, and they were, oh, you can just stay there, back. And that's just, it's, that was I don't know when Airbnb was founded, but it was at least 10 years, right?
Absolutely.
12 years. So it's and that's, I don't even give it a second thought, but we'll have the same kind of thing for AI, probably much shorter, maybe in 5 years or something, but it'll take a while for that change to propagate. And at the same time, it's going to be super lopsided given how large of a technological shift it'll be and who's going to have access to it first. So I don't exactly know. I think there's kind of you can kind of make predictions on some long-term stable equilibria. In 10 years, it might look this. And in the next 2 months, it might look this. But in between, when everything's changing really fast, it's just companies will come and go. When GPT-3 first came out, you had the wave of copy assistants, and people made millions off of it. It's a gold rush, right? You make it, and you sell it, and you're good. So I'm not very good at that. I think a lot of people are really good at that, but I lost in crypto and all that stuff. So I think in the short to medium run, I have no idea. I think it's worth thinking in 10 to 15 years what it might look like. And again, who knows? That's also just a super long time as well.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's fantastic. Cool. So, I mean, obviously we can't always make sort of money off crypto or these sort of short term, selling these sort of generative language models really quickly and just sort of white labeling, whatever it is in that sort of short term gold rush. But long term, I guess, I don't know if you've ever thought of this. Do you have any sort of ideas of sort of SaaS companies that maybe you yourself might start, or any ideas that you think would be cool for somebody else to start? Any ideas on that, or anything that you've ever thought of, or at least maybe even a field?
I personally like the mental health therapy space quite a bit, or kind of the working with both acute diagnoses, depression and anxiety, and just kind of the general stuff that a lot of data. Even if you're not diagnosable, we all have some kind of stuff we're working with and dealing with. And I think something around that would be interesting. I don't know if it would be a SaaS or it'd be a community thing or something, but who knows? I just think the space is really interesting. I'm learning about it, and I think AI will change it a ton with AI therapy chatbots and all that kind of stuff. And there's still going to be a real need for people. So yeah, it's something I'm kind of loosely thinking about. Yeah, manufacturing is going to be pretty interesting. I think my dad works in the space, so it's kind of something I kind of think about loosely, but not as close to. Yeah. I don't know. I think just I think just following curiosity and interest, whatever. For any of these things, you kind of have to just get really into it. And some people are into one thing for a long time. Some people are into a thing for a year or two at a time. Yeah. Both are totally fine, but I think you just have to know your personality style and make sure it lines up with how the world works.
Yeah. So would you say that's probably one of your top sort of tips for the general sort of career advice? Because I think actually just having this conversation, you've actually put out a few gems yourself, just talking
Thanks,
about not
man.
just life but also work as well. And yeah, just general. Do you have any other sort of career advice that you give? I know you've just mentioned, for example, that you kind of have to know yourself a little bit. Pick if you're a generalist, you have to make that your sort of forte. And if you kind of want to
Yeah.
drill down a little bit, then you really have to do this. Any other sort of career advice that you may have received or heard about, or something, just anything else that might have really helped you in terms
Yeah,
of the
I
main one?
really, I really. So there's a guy named there's a publication called Every, published by Dan Shipper, and his co-founder is Nathan Bashes. I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but it's really good, and I add a lot.
I'll leave a link
So
later.
personal
Yeah.
plug for the Every publication, as well as I have a friend in Austin named Paul Millard who writes. He has a book called The Pathless Path that came out, and again, and I bring up Every because something that Dan has been talking about a lot more in his writing is productivity is emotional regulation. And just thinking through,
Mm,
I think again, if we really take seriously the idea that long-term careers and long-term success is built off the day-to-day, what is the day-to-day made of but excitement and our nervous system and just anger and just kind of like, oh, look, don't want to think about this, I'm procrastinating on this, or I'm frustrated about, just kind of dealing with the moment-to-moment stuff that comes up. Because when you kind of are able to, some of that stuff could take a week or a month to process versus you can do it in minutes. Then you kind of just you iterate a lot faster. Your slope is just a lot different. So
yeah.
it's super counterintuitive, and I'm not successful enough to like have it be to be a role model for this, I think. But I'm super strong on believing that a lot of the conceptual top-down career advice, all really really helpful and worth reflecting on, but also thinking about your moment-to-moment experience throughout the day,
Mm,
I think is quite good. And then the Paul Millard, he writes about the pathless path, which I think is kind of, if you take Tim Ferriss's 4 Hour Work Week and what's after that in some sense, I think that's kind of what I view that as. And it's really
right.
about understanding your relationship to your career goals and where things are, and you know trying freelancing for a bit and seeing. I feel we've both done it. I think it's been invaluable to our careers because I think afterwards you kind of have more conviction on the type of work that is a better
Of
fit for
course.
you.
Yeah.
I think the good thing about the world is that there are way more types of work that are valid these days than what would have been 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, maybe in the medieval ages, perhaps,
Yeah, I know.
it's
And
probably
really,
either
there's just
farming or.
totally, all this stuff goes out the window when you are in wartime mode. I mean, you just got to do what you got to
Mhm.
do.
Yeah,
But I think it's helpful to know that we're often not in wartime mode, and you can kind of work with your interests. And I think in the long run, that leads to more success when you can.
of
But
course.
sometimes you just got
Yeah.
to do what you got to do, and just take the job that's difficult but pays well or whatever, right?
Well, absolutely. So, on that note, final question on, you mentioned the day to day, any sort of favorite sort of productivity hack, software that you use, or obviously you read is there any sort of practice that you do every day? It could be a software, it could be a practice that just helps you in that sort of day to day just to get stuff
Yeah.
done. Perhaps, yeah.
There's one called non-sleep deep rest, NSDR. So
Oh,
Andrew Huberman, he's got a big science podcast and stuff. He kind of talks about it, and it comes from this meditation technique called Yoga Nidra, which is basically sleep meditation, and it's really great. And basically, it's really reframed my idea of rest because I used to, I'm not going to nap in the workday. That just sounds bad, especially
yeah.
but you can. But honestly, you can take these days in between a meeting or something. I'll just take 5 minutes, put a timer on, and put a guided yoga nidra or NSDR, or even now that I kind of know how to do it, I'll do it myself, 5-10 minutes, and just close your eyes and breathe in a certain way and rest your body in a certain way. It's almost, instead of looking for that second or third cup of coffee, I'll just do an NSDR and I'll feel way better and I'll
Wow,
just have
incredible.
genuine rest. And then you can kind of go in with clarity and actual sharpness to work. So that I do think that's a hack if it is one, and it
Nice.
kind of adds up over
I
time too.
agree. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because sometimes you don't have the option of taking a nap. You might be in a noisy train or a place. I
Yes,
think it's great to have more options than just coffee or power nap because you don't always have
yes,
either at hand. So
and
I think
it's
having that's a
helpful.
nice
It's helpful to
setup.
have something where I know that in the next 5 minutes I will feel better.
Yes, exactly. No matter where I am or no matter what I do,
Yeah,
it's. I think that's awesome. Well, yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Pranab. I think I'm gonna give you some of the time back. Honestly, thank you so much for all of that amazing, gems and great insights there. Where can people find Boundless or yourself if they want to get in touch with
yeah,
yourself?
that's a great question. I haven't thought of that. So Boundless's website is bvco.co. So that's great. My email is pranabsachi@gmail.com. That's probably good. And then I have Substack, I guess, but I haven't really written much. So
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Pranab. Yeah, for now, I gotta work on my internet presence. It's in the works.
That's in the words. Yeah, don't worry about that. Yeah, I think we all wish we could do more of that. But yeah, no,
Totally.
honestly, thank you so much, Pranav. And yeah, look forward to catching up in your next couple of ventures then.
Yeah, cool, man. Thank you. Appreciate it.